If you guys can sit down. Yasu, I'm kidding. Okay, so I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, Elsi Kaiser, whose talk is Who Said That? Referential Effects During Processing of Subjective and Objective Adjectives.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to start by saying that this is work with Jesse Storbeck, who is not here today because he's filing his dissertation. Today is the deadline, so he's about to become Dr. Storbeck. So I figured that was more important than coming here. So here's the 30-second summary because it's the last day of the conference, and you can tune out after this if you'd like. I'm going to present to you today a webcam-based eye tracking study showing that the idea that certain linguistic expressions make us retrieve previously mentioned reference, that this can be extended to a new class that we don't usually think of as being anaphoric, namely adjectives. And very much a work in progress, so reactions and shock and feedback and criticisms, very welcome. Now in language, we have lots of different types of referential dependencies that we're all familiar with pronouns, reflexives, or with like sluicing constructions or WH movement, where there's kind of something that harks back to something that was mentioned before in the sentence. And today I'm going to ask, what about adjectives? Could they trigger a process like this? Now you might be thinking, okay, this is kind of sounding a bit crazy. If we have a sentence like, Ben told John that the meal was vegetarian. Well, vegetarian's obviously talking about the meal. But I wanted to now have us think a bit more about Ben, about the source of information. Because we know from other work that the source of information has a special status in communicative contexts. We know this from other work showing that it tends to be the perspectival center when it comes to logophoric pronouns and various other elements, and some adjectival work we've done in my lab before, also looking at evidentiality systems in language. So we can ask, might it be the case that we get source retrieval effects during real-time processing? So if you hear a sentence like this, could it be that comprehenders retrieve the source of information referent when they process the embedded clause, even though Ben isn't mentioned in that embedded clause? And here we're presuming a context where the identity of the source is relevant to the processing task. Now let's think about another very similar sentence where I just changed the adjective and now we say the meal was delicious. Now delicious is expressing somebody's opinion. It's a subjective adjective. And if we think about, well, whose opinion? Hopefully if you're like other participants we've tested, you will say Ben's opinion, presumably. Now, this distinction between subjective and objective adjectives that I've introduced is a well-known thing in the literature. So with something like vegetarian, here the source is providing information about an objective fact. Now we might quibble about what exactly should be defined as vegetarian, but once we agree on a definition, then it's more of a factual issue. Whereas when it comes to things like delicious, here we have the source's subjective opinion about something. And if we have a debate about is this delicious or not, or what's delicious, these are subjective debates and people can disagree. And if I spoke Latin, I could impress you with that quote there about there's no debating about matters of taste. And we actually know from prior work that we've done that we tend to interpret these subjective adjectives as expressing the opinion of the source character. Now, the special status of subjective adjectives is well known in the semantic literature. So this idea that the subjective adjectives and objective adjectives with different semantic meanings has been introduced and discussed a lot. And there's this key idea that subjective adjectives have as part of their meaning this judge parameter that expresses the person whose opinion the adjective conveys. Here's one way of formalizing it. This is from Lagerson's work in semantics, where we have this little J for judge, which anchors the opinion to whoever's the judge referent. We don't have to call it a judge. We don't have to use this formalism. Other ones would work too. I just wanted to mention this because it's a commonly used term. So going back to our example, when you hear Ben saying the meal is delicious, in essence, the idea is that delicious gets like a little subscript saying Ben, like link it back to Ben. So the adjective is anchored to an opinion holder. So then, if this kind of thinking is on the right track, and if this happens during online processing, we can ask, do we get judge retrieval effects? So when a comprehender encounters a subjective adjective, do they retrieve the judge or the opinion holder that's linked to that adjective during online processing. And these, from what we know, are pretty open questions. Do correct me if I'm wrong, but we couldn't find other prior work on this kind of potential source retrieval effects, or what's going to be our main theoretical focus, the judge retrieval effects during online processing. So we wanted to kind of poke at this. Turns out it's a bit harder to research than one might have thought, so here's where I would love to hear your feedback and criticism. I'll be telling you about a visual world eye tracking study that we used to try to detect effects of source and judge retrieval effects. So people saw pictures, heard sentences, and we tracked their eye gaze, and we tested sentences like the ones you see here. So Ben told John that the meal at the event was vegetarian or delicious, or a passive version, was told by. Now, the reason we looked at actives and passives is because it allows us to disentangle the status of the source from primacy and recency and from grammatical role. So any special effects we get of the source being special cannot be reduced to subjecthood or to linear order because we've deconfounded those. And we had 20 different subjective and objective adjectives. I can show you those at the end if you're curious. So how was this set up? So it was visual world. So people saw this picture in the beginning with two characters, two male or two female characters, and they heard the beginning of the sentence. Then they hear the meal at the event was, and the meal pops up, and then they hear delicious. And then the picture stayed on the screen for 3 more seconds, and then we moved on to the next screen. Crucially, the picture of the meal only pops up when you're hearing the meal at the event was, and then it disappears. Now, when it pops up, it attracts people's eye gaze to the middle of the screen to a neutral location equidistant between the two characters, what people call the look away, and then it pops away. So there's no more meal visible here, no more object, whatever it was, on this critical screen. So when the adjective starts, people no longer see the meal. And this is the screen where we eye track them. So at this point, they only see the two characters, and they're hearing the adjective. So this is the crucial screen. Now, after each trial, in this first version I'll tell you about, we had an opinion question. So we asked people who thought that the meal was vegetarian or delicious. And this was shown on the screen, and then you clicked. And by the way, we counterbalanced left, right. We mixed up names and pictures just to make sure there's no effects coming from pictures or names or anything like that. Now, why did we have this opinion question? We were very worried about shallow processing, especially in like an online internet context, because this was done remotely, as I'll get into more detail shortly. And there is, for example, this really interesting paper from a while ago by Stewart et al. Looking at pronoun processing, where they tested sentences like those three in the middle with ambiguous pronouns or with unambiguous pronouns, and they manipulated what kinds of questions their participants got. Some people got shallow questions, like here, you could answer the shallow question without having to resolve the pronoun. Another group got deep questions, and answering the deep question required resolving the pronoun. And basically what they found is that the shallow people left a pronoun unspecified, showed no effects of anything. So it was really only the deep group where people were bothering to resolve the pronoun. And we were kind of afraid of something happening like this with us. So we wanted to make sure people were engaging in deep processing, and hence we had the opinion question in the first version. As I said, we used webcam-based eye tracking. So this was the WebGazer plugin with the PC IBEX. So people could do this at home, at their own computer, with their own webcam. So take that, COVID. And we recruited people via Prolific. And I'm happy to discuss all the things we learned about how to try to make this work remotely, if anybody's interested. Now, here's a video, thanks to Sarah Lee, one of my former students. This is going to be her following the mouse with her eyes, just to give you a sense of how the eye tracker, how the WebGazer looks. So if you see that little mouse and then that little red dot is her eye gaze, it's a bit small, but it gives you a sense that it's actually not bad, right? You know, she's following the mouse, and those dots are actually showing pretty accurately, or it's tracking her pretty well. Okay. Now, there is still, I mean, that was just an impressionistic demo. People have looked in more careful, principled ways at how reliable is this webcam-based eye tracking. And there's a recent paper, for example, by Slim and Hartstreaker, or a recent manuscript, where they conclude that it's pretty reliable for looking at like quadrant-based analyses. Like you wouldn't want to do reading eye tracking, for example, and the regions can't be too small. And this like density plots also give you a pretty good sense of the range of accuracy. And the timing stuff gets a bit more hairy. So as you'll see today later, we're mostly focusing on like the regions. We don't make specific timing predictions, but I'm very happy to talk more about this. But the pictures we're dealing with, we have the two characters far apart. So hopefully this is going to be good enough to be able to not get the looks confused between the left and the right character. So hopefully thumbs up. Now the predictions for the opinion question, we can call it kind of the click data. These are pretty straightforward, not really our main focus. This was just to make sure people are paying attention and are on task. And given the prior work we've done with adjectives, we predicted that people would mostly interpret the source character, the subject with actives and the biphrase object with passives, as being the one who thinks, whatever it is, and we might get a effect of active versus passive due to topicality or something. And indeed, if we look at the data, here's a proportion of source responses. We basically see the expected preference that people interpret the source as the opinion holder. So this is a good sanity check, not super surprising given what we've shown before. Let's turn to the eye tracking, because this is the more interesting predictions. So where are people looking when they hear the adjective and when they see that kind of screen there at the top? If source retrieval effects are occurring during real-time processing in a context where we made the source's identity relevant due to the opinion question, then we predict that both subjective and objective adjectives should trigger more looks to the source than to the perceiver during real-time processing. I think this is a pretty obvious prediction. I'd be very disappointed if this didn't come out. Then what is theoretically perhaps more interesting is the possibility of these judge retrieval effects. So if subjective adjectives, if this class of adjectives that's being claimed by semanticists to be semantically different from objective adjectives, if they are triggering some kind of judge retrieval during real time, then we expect more source looks with subjective adjectives than with objective adjectives. And this is because it's only with the subjective adjectives that there's this judge, which is the source. With objective adjectives, there is no judge. It's just objective fact. There's no judge in their semantics. So whatever we see with the objective ones should just be the regular source retrieval effects. So let's see. So do we see source retrieval effects? More looks to source than perceiver character overall. And then do we get these judge retrieval effects with subjective adjectives? So do we get an even bigger boost in the source looks with subjective adjectives compared to objective ones? So here, just to get us oriented, this is one of the active sentences. And here I'm showing just a proportion of looks to the different regions there, and a time on the x-axis beginning at the adjective. And here what we see is first people are looking at the middle, at the no longer visible meal. So we successfully got their eyes to go to that middle region, which is good. Then we see this rapid increase in looks to the source referent with the blue lines, and the looks to the perceiver reference stay pretty low throughout. This is for the active. When we look at the passive, we see something very similar. Again, people started off by looking at the middle of the screen, just like we intended. Then we see an increase in looks to the source, and the looks to the perceiver stay low. So here we do see more looks to the source referent than to the perceiver referent overall. And this is, in some sense, kind of a sanity check. Given the question we're asking them, the opinion question, we would really hope to see this anyway. It's also very reassuring that like the WebGazer data looks pretty reasonable. I'm not focusing too much on the precise timing details, because that's a bit of a question, but the shape of the curves and everything makes a lot of sense. We thought that was nice. So we get evidence of source retrieval in the context we put people in this study. Now, what about judge retrieval? Do we get these differential effects with subjective versus objective adjectives? So here, if you've been looking carefully at the graphs, I might be a bit small, you can already see that we have the objective adjectives with the open circles and the subjective ones with the filled in circles. And if we kind of look at this, we're already seeing differences between the filled in circles and the open circles. It's hard to see. So we're going to replot things just because I want to keep you on your toes. And yeah, so we already see kind of promising patterns, but let's plot this in an easier way and actually do stats on it. So here, to look at the judge retrieval effect question, we're going to be computing a source advantage score. So the looks to the source minus looks to the perceiver. So the more positive the number, the more the source is preferred over the perceiver character. And if subjective adjectives are triggering, if they have kind of a stronger source preference, if they're triggering those judge retrievals, we should see the teal line being above the orange line. And indeed, here for the active and passive, this is what we find. So in both cases, so the teal line is higher than the orange line. So we are getting more looks to the, or a stronger source preference with subjective adjectives than with objective adjectives. And this is significant. And we also get a marginal effect of voice, and we can talk about that, but no interaction. So what we've seen so far is we do see signs of these source retrieval effects, and also that adjective type matters. So people are looking at we think we have evidence that the subjective adjectives are triggering activation of the judge referent, unlike the objective ones, which don't have a judge to retrieve. So when you hear something like delicious, the idea would be that your brain does go, okay, we need to anchor this to an opinion holder. That in this case is Ben, so let's look at Ben. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I want to tell you about something you might be worrying about, namely, how automatic are these effects? Is it the case that we always automatically retrieve the source and the judge, or is it that we retrieve them if they're relevant or if they're available, and maybe otherwise we don't? And in thinking about this, I want to point out a difference between pronouns and subjective adjectives. Namely, unlike like he, she, they, these adjectives don't always have a referential judge. We can get these generic people in general interpretations. And there's a lot of semantic work on this, but if you think about something like, the cake must be tasty, but I wouldn't know because I don't like chocolate, or I wouldn't like because I don't like chocolate. Here, it means kind of tasty to people in general, tasty to the average taster. So here, there's not really a particular referent for us to grab. So this seems to kind of challenge this idea that opinion one puts forth, that these adjectives can't always be necessarily grabbing particular reference. It may be sometimes there's nobody available if we're getting a generic reading, for example. So keeping this in mind, we did a follow-up study, same study as before, but now we had no opinion question. So what this means is the source referent is no longer task relevant, because we're not asking the opinion question anymore. And as concerns the judge, we have now made this generic interpretation much more available, because it's not clear that these have to be people's own opinions. And I can unpack this more if you're curious. So as a reminder, here's what we saw in the first experiment. We saw looks to the source. That's the blue lines peaking. In the second experiment, we see no looks to the source. So the looks to the source and the perceiver now do not differ once we take away the opinion question. Looks to the judge. In the first experiment, we saw teal line above orange line, significantly more looks to the judge with subjective adjectives and with objective adjectives. In the second experiment, when we allow the generic interpretation where there is no particular judge to look for in the display necessarily, we also do not see evidence for the judge retrieval. So where does this leave us? I think we can say that in the right context, adjectives, which we don't typically think of as being anaphoric, can still trigger looks to previously mentioned reference. And these kind of dependency building triggered by the adjectives seems to behave in semantically principled ways. In particular, it maps on very nicely to this well-researched, well-established distinction between subjective and objective adjectives, and this idea that subjective adjectives have this special piece that pulls in the opinion holder. However, we also do find that these retrieval processes do not appear to be automatic, which, as I would like to argue, is actually a nice feature, because these subjective adjectives are not like pronouns in that they don't always refer to a particular person. So once we make a generic reading more available, and once we make the source no longer crucial, we get a whole different picture emerging. There's a lot of open questions, of course. We were so far looking only at third-person judges and sources. The first person is known to be privileged as a judge. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with first-person reference, like, I told Anna, blah, blah, blah. This is hard to eye track. So we can think about how to do that. There's also a lot of other judge-dependent expressions, things like the local pub or to the left of the tree. So we can ask, when people process these types of expressions, are they activating their perspectival center that these things are anchored to, and what is that center anyway, and so on. So we can kind of ask similar questions with a whole host of other linguistic phenomena, I think. There's also a lot of interesting methodological questions that we've been thinking a lot about with like the WebGazer that I would be very happy to chat with people about. And currently, we're also looking at doing the same study basically with COVID opinions, with subjective and objective adjectives. But now we're also asking people afterwards about their own attitudes about various things. And I think this could be interesting because it can complement this stuff I just showed you by indicating whether people's own opinions are kind of leaking into how they're representing other people's opinions. And we ran like 200 people on this, the most I've ever eye-tracked, because we want to be able to have, hopefully some level of power to be able to pick up on like the individual variation, how people feel about things like masks and vaccines. So we still got to get that data under control. But let me stop there and thank you for your attention, and thanks to various students who have helped me with this.
Hi, thanks, Elsie. That was really great. I have a maybe dumb question. So I was wondering if the difference between the two experiments about asking people like whose opinion was this or not isn't so much one of either retrieving the judge or not, but instantiating the judge in the first place. Like, is it possible that when they don't need to care about people's opinions, they just never consider the possibility that one character or the other needs to be a judge in the ensuing context?
Yes, yes, good point. Let me kind of say that back to you. Just so the idea would be that in like the second experiment where they could kind of be more generic, even like the semantics I build for that adjective might just not have any kind of judge in the semantics of that adjective. Therefore, I'm not going to retrieve anything because it's not even there.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess what I was thinking is in the first experiment, they're sort of learning that I have to care whose opinion I need to know about, right? So as they're hearing the sentence, as it's unfolding, they're sort of instantiating the discourse representation for themselves, and they assign one person a judge before they even get to the adjective at the end. And then they get to the adjective, and sometimes they need to care about the judge, sometimes they don't, and sure, when they need to care about the judge, that causes retrieval. But in the second experiment, they just never bother instantiating a judge.
That's a really interesting idea, and I don't know, because in the first study, we're kind of using the adjectives as like the test to probe for the judge. So if that could be happening, especially because these PPTs, they can get this a generic reading. So yeah, but this anticipatory judge building, that would be, I think, interesting to look into. I'm not quite sure how we could measure.
Well, so I guess what I was wondering is if you had done any sort of order analysis on your first experiment to see if these effects emerged over the course of the experiment, or if this was something that...
If you look at, like, yes, so we did, and they are, it's not just, I think they're there in like, I mean, I feel like visualize, first half, last half, or first, third, last, I think they're there early on.
Okay.
But yeah, I think there's like other interesting issues that your question brings up. Yeah, but it wasn't something that only showed up at like the end.
Cool, great, thank you.
So, thank you.
Hey, Elsie. So we were just discussing this at lunch. This is actually more of a comment for the group, though you can comment on my comment if you have a comment, which is with regards to the timing issues, right? There are, the paper that you cited does have some timing issues. For like brief explanation for folks is that your computers have multiple clocks in them. And they aren't necessarily synchronized. So the programmer has to be careful to make sure they've synchronized the clocks. And if you don't do that, your timing for WebGazer is not going to be great. I think if you look at the JS Psych implementation, has pretty good timing. So this is something that you just want to be aware of in looking at it. Everybody's using WebGazer, but whether they've done the integration with the clock synchronization, I think is variable.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think like the timing questions are very, very important. And I feel like that's something that I was trying to kind of hint at, that I don't want to make strong commitments about the timing. There could be all kinds of shifting. I mean, here we do kind of see what look like meaningful curves, but like the absolute timing, I don't think I'm in a position to kind of make any claims. It actually would be super interesting to do like, and maybe people have done this, kind of more principled comparisons between like the different implementations using WebGazer, and I would still be, like I was mentioning, I'd be very careful with studies that are hinging on precise timing distinctions to distinguish hypotheses, because I would want to know more before I use that. But I thought, like, for our purposes, and even our analyses, we're looking at like big time windows because we didn't have hypotheses that were specific to that. But I think this is something that the field as a whole, I think it's really important for us to think about. Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Hi, Joel Wallenberg, University of York. I was just wondering if you think when they're looking at the judge, if they're retrieving source and judge, and it's like retrieve source look, retrieve judge look, like that, and so it actually is more looks because they're retrieving both. And if that's true, then I wonder if you could do something where you've dissociated source and judge, so you get Ben told Anna that John thinks the food is delicious or something like that, and then get sort of an additive effect where they're looking at source and judge and it's adding up to what you saw before. I don't know.
Thank you. That is super interesting. Yeah, because here we have, in like this first pass, we have the source is also the judge in
Right,
these
yeah.
sentences, and we kind of knew that from like prior work, so we figured, hey, let's build on that and let's do that here too. But I really like the idea of like pulling them apart. Yeah, so like A told B that C thinks that the meal was tasty or something. Yeah. So I would, yes, that would actually be super interesting. Yeah, because then we could pull them apart. And I don't know, at this point, I could speculate widely about additive versus non-additive, but I think that's an empirical question. So we should totally do that. Thank you. That is a really nice idea.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chris Cummins, Edinburgh. I think that's beautiful work. So this is, I don't like to do it, but to play devil's advocate with experiment one, something that strikes me as bound up with the personal taste element is that if you say, Ben told John that the meal was vegetarian, I think that can refer to a future meal that nobody's eaten yet. Because the was is going to acquire the tense marking or inherit the tense marking of told.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think if you say Ben told John that the meal was tasty, you can't really say that about a future event. That has to be a meal somebody has experienced, or at least it's very much more likely to be. That made me think that maybe the looking behavior is along the lines of an expectation about who's now going to be engaged with this. Because if I tell you that the meal was tasty, maybe there's an expectation I'm now going to tell you more about the meal. Or rather, all you can say about it is, oh, that's nice for you. Whereas if I tell you that the meal was vegetarian that is planned at the conference dinner next week, I might expect a reply where John said that in that case he would go. And I wondered if that might be a cause of a looking difference. It may just be very specific to that item, in which case it's probably not a relevant point.
Yeah, no, so let's see. Well, I mean, we know that PPTs in particular, and I think ours, I mean, I'll try to stick pretty closely to this PPT predictors of personal taste class. We do know that they do require this acquaintance inference. I mean, this like direct experience. That's one of the semantic hallmarks of them. But I don't know, but I'm not quite sure whether I fully understood the question about the.
Well, it struck me that the vegetarian example could be used to report Ben telling John something about something that's going to happen in the future, with a view to establishing, if I say, is John going to the dinner? Well, Ben told John, sorry, is John going to the dinner?
Mm-hmm.
Ben told John that the meal was vegetarian.
Okay.
And John said that in that case he would go.
Okay.
So just that idea that because it's has possible future reference, maybe it kind of hands the conversation over to the other person, and that could be a looking relevant thing.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, and that context helped me get the future reading. Yeah. Super. Okay. I'd have to think more about that. I don't know if that would predict the particular pattern we got with the subjective versus objective, but the tense point and the future distinction, that is very well taken, actually. And there's a whole literature thinking about like tense effects with perspective.
I think experimenting may solve the problem anyway, but we should maybe talk.
Yeah, I'd love to actually talk more about that. Yeah, because tense is something that I've been kind of trying to steer away from, but I'm realizing I need to take tense very seriously. So thank you. Yeah, I'd love to talk more. Thanks.
Okay, let's thank Elsi one more time, please.
Thank you.